Hi, everybody. If I could ask you to take your seats, please. We're going to begin so that we can get you out of here on time. Okay, everybody, thank you for coming. My name is Sarah Cohen. I work for CJE SeniorLife, and our organization is part of the Orthodox Network. So as you probably know, the Orthodox Network is a collaboration of social service providers and Jewish agencies who work in partnership to improve services to the Orthodox community in the metropolitan Chicago area. So today's forum is going to be about identifying cultural barriers within Orthodox Jewish communities to seeking a variety of human services and how to help overcome these barriers. We'll be learning about available services that intentionally address Orthodox individuals and families' human service needs, and also discuss the efforts on the part of the Orthodox Jewish community to destigmatize the need for services. So I want to start by just thanking the sponsoring organizations. JCFS Chicago, thank you for hosting this event. The ARC, High Lifeline Midwest, CJE SeniorLife, come on in. JCC Chicago, Jewish Neighborhood Development Council of Chicago, Hinda Institute, Libenu, Midwest Refuah Health Center, Nefesh Chicago, No Shame on You, Shalva, Sharsheret, Upward Community, and Yachad Chicago. So as you can see, we have quite a group of Orthodox communities coming together to meaningfully address the issues that come up in our community. Before we get started, a couple of notes. There are two cultural competency CEUs available for social workers, psychologists, and counselors. I'm sure there's a sign-in sheet somewhere. Rabbi? No? Is there a sign-in sheet?
So the way to get your CEUs is by submitting the evaluation we'll talk about later.
That's how we get you to do the evaluation. Okay, and this program will be recorded. So I want to thank you all for coming, people from Chicago and from outside of the Chicago community. I believe we are reaching out to you. I want to thank the planning committee for this event, Jeffrey Blumenfeld, Devora Greenfield, Dr. Malcolm Miller, Nicole Druckman, Ed Loew, Esther Yona Friedman, Rabbi David Rosenberg, Samantha Spolter, and Wendy Singer. Each of these speakers will be speaking for 15 minutes, and their presentations will be followed by a Q&A session. So please hold your questions until the Q&A part of the conversation. We will then ask you to fill out your evaluations. Do we want evaluations filled out before people leave, or they can go home and fill them out?
That's up to you.
Okay, but in order to get the CE credit, fill out the evaluation. And if you haven't yet, please silence your cell phones. So I now have the honor of introducing our esteemed panel. To my right is Rabbi Yechiel Bresler. He's the Assistant Director of Upward Community. Rabbi Bresler earned his master's in mental health counseling from Furkhoff Graduate School of Psychology. Rabbi Bresler has been a member of the Upward Community team since September of 2019. In addition to his role as Assistant Director, he is a clinician and oversees the educational programming, including community lectures and Mental Health Matters podcast. Rabbi Bresler also serves as the assistant rabbi at Congregation K.I.N.S. And my colleague, Tamara Kushnir Groman, manages the Irving H. and Jane W. Goldberg Legal Services at CJE. She also manages the Benefit Services Department. Tamara is a licensed attorney and has a practice background in legal services with Legal Assistance Foundation of Metropolitan Chicago. She has worked for the Judicial Law Clerk, Honorable James Epstein, and Tamara received her BA in Politics, Philosophy, and Economics from the University of Pennsylvania and her law degree from Loyola University. Then we have Edward Loew, who is currently the director of the NAP Counseling Center of JCFS. Before Edward, or Eddie, I think as most people know him, joined JCFS team. He worked for over 25 years at Causes, which is a child abuse agency dealing with sexual abuse. His work there included working with clients of all ages, offenders, families, and groups. And he's a member of the JCERT team, which responds to traumatic situations in our community and beyond. He's been involved in the Orthodox Jewish community for over 40 years and has been instrumental in awareness training for children and adults. And last but not least, we have Dr. Marni Rosen, who's Midwest Refuah's clinical director. Dr. Rosen is a supervisor, consultant, and trainer on trauma-informed psychotherapy and art therapy, a licensed clinical psychologist and board-certified art therapist. She completed her postdoctoral fellowship at the Post-Traumatic Stress Center in New Haven, Connecticut, and was a research assistant at Yale University. Dr. Rosen is passionate about providing a warm, culturally sensitive mental health clinic for Chicago community members. So without further ado, we will begin. And again, please just save your questions, which we would love to have until the Q&A session that follows each presentation, or at the end of all the presentations. So Rabbi Bresler.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me? Okay. I usually most often speak on Shabbos, so I don't usually see how this works. Okay, so if you don't hear me or if you hear me too much, just let me know. First of all, thank you for inviting me, for including me on this illustrious panel. I feel utterly incompetent up here, but I appreciate it. Hopefully I'm not. Hopefully it's just my own, my own work that I'm doing here. But thank you really for putting this together, the whole planning committee, and thank you all for coming out. So I have till 9:23, right? I get to go first. So if I go till 10:30, you'll forgive me. Okay, so I just want to start, and I was told to try to focus from the rabbinic perspective. For me, a lot of my work that I do, both as the assistant rabbi at K.I.N.S and my work at Upward, is really hard to divide because I view it as so much intertwined in the work. So I'm going to try to bring those together and give you that perspective for whatever it's worth, from really both that rabbinic perspective and the perspective as a therapist. For my own self-conscious and ability to move forward, I will, just full disclosure, I plan in a month, I'm actually transitioning out of my job at K.I.N.S and going fully into mental health as a therapist. Hopefully the last 4 years of which I've served and the training that I had as a rabbi informs this presentation. It was not to talk about myself, but just for a little bit of information. It's partially because of what we're going to be talking about this morning that drove me in this direction, because I love the rabbinate and I love the field of mental health, and there is so much to give and to do in this field in our community. So I hope that I fill that niche a little bit. So I want to start just with talking about a couple of barriers. I think I'm going to talk about 4 kind of different areas of barriers, and then give some thought as to maybe as a community what we can do to address these barriers, and perhaps hopefully we'll leave with some resources also. So the 4 areas of barriers that I want to talk about are number 1, stigma, which is probably the area of the barrier that we would probably all think of first. So stigma, and I'll go into each of these all in a moment as well, but stigma, religious limitations, how the religious life and implications and community may impact upon our willingness to seek care. I don't plan on talking about, maybe touching on very, very briefly, because I know Dr. Rosen is going to speak about the financial barrier that is in place. And number 4, perhaps the one which is most overlooked, is actually the barrier of time. Nice. So, okay, so number 1, stigma. So when we talk about stigma, and I want to just point out, when we talk about stigma, we actually, we have, that is so confusing. Yeah. Might be. That's cool. That's all. Yeah, anyone who's on Zoom, if you want to. There you go. All right, well, it stopped, so they hung up or they answered. Okay, so number 1, stigma, right? So when we talk about stigma, first of all, we have to realize that even in my short time in the field, already I noticed a difference. stigma that has occurred. All right, I think I get the hint. Okay, but when we talk about stigma, even in my short time here, I have already realized how much as a community that we have changed and we have grown in terms of the stigma. I'll tell you one very brief story now and another one in a few minutes, which is our executive director, K.I.N.S. Recently, I was talking to her, and she told me that, you know, when a lot of what we do is we work with the schools throughout the Orthodox community. We work with all the whole slew of schools. And there were a number of schools, without naming any names, that when by we, I mean people in Upward or then Madrigos before I was there, would call the schools. They would literally get on the phone, call the school, say this is so-and-so from Madrigos Midwest, and they would hear a click because the schools would not even be willing to talk to them. And so those same schools right now, at this point, are utilizing many of our services, allow us into their schools for programming, send their students to us in the clinic. And so we as a community, in all segments of the community, have come a tremendous way. And I believe we have a tremendous way to go because there are definitely areas of stigma in our community that still are hesitant to approach resources, to approach the need for mental health because of that stigma. And that stigma is for a number of reasons. Right? That stigma is because when we live in a more insular community, which by definition, the Orthodox community is a more insular community, and different segments of the Orthodox community are more insulated than the other, right? But the more insulated we get, the more stigma there's going to be, because the more we understand what a person's going through, the more we think we understand what a person's going through, the more tight-knit, right, that we are when we're marrying people within that same community, how that impacts it, right? How we have to be concerned how our own children or how their siblings or how their parents or cousins are getting, right, are viewed from a mental health perspective and how that may impact upon their ability to get married. And so there's a whole slew of reasons why the stigma plays an even larger role within the Orthodox community. And on top of that, I think that the question of understanding mental health. Right? Many people don't view mental health in the same way as they would view a physical illness. They think that, oh, mental health is, you know, we're so soft in this day and age, or right, it's just it's poor parenting or whatever the reason is. People don't understand that no, mental health very often is a chemical imbalance in your brain. Mental health very often has a major genetics component, and so merely the lack of understanding of mental health also certainly contributes to the stigma. And so area number one is based off of the fact that we are a more insulated community. We definitely have an elevated sense of that stigma. While we have come a tremendous way, we certainly have a ways to go. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that soon. Number two, religious limitations. The religious limitations, right? So there are those who have the concerns of, when I get involved in the therapeutic process, how will that potentially impact on my religious observance? Will I become less concerned, right? Take, for instance, there's an idea of religious scrupulosity, which is basically when a person has OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which uniquely manifests itself in religious practices. As so the famous discussion in the halachic literature is when someone says the Shema over and over and over again, right? Because, well, maybe I didn't say it right. So now we're going to say, okay, you need to go to therapy, right? Or hopefully we say it differently than that. But now that person goes to therapy, and through the therapeutic process, maybe they're hesitant because, well, what is that going to do to me? Now I'm going to not do that, and well, maybe I won't fulfill the mitzvah as appropriate. Now, yes, that in and of itself is diagnostic, and that's some of the work that is done in therapy. But before a person's in therapy, when we talk about barriers, a person may have that hesitation because of what impact of Jewish law how will that be impacted by my engagement in therapy? Additionally, there's this belief that I fully understand, but don't necessarily completely agree with within the Orthodox community, which is, if I'm going to go to therapy, I need a religious provider. And if I don't have a religious provider, I'm not going to therapy. Now, we're growing in religious providers, but we don't have enough, right? As anyone here can talk about the waiting lists, right? There's far more demand. And I get needing that comfort of having a religious provider. And I will say, I do believe there are some areas of work that may be better suited with a religious provider. And I will also say that there are some areas of work that actually may be better suited not with a religious provider. And so I think that idea of needing a religious provider is in itself a limitation as well. There's also the question when it comes to higher levels of care. What are the religious manifestations of going to higher level of care in terms of keeping kosher, in terms of Shabbos, Yom Tov, all of these different factors which may come up in questions in terms of how the engaging on any different level of care of mental health support may impact upon my religious observance. And finally, within that, right, the question of, well, how will it impact my child's ability to be in a religious school? And what will the mental health ramifications be if my kid's school finds out that they're struggling with X, Y, or Z? Now we'll see that that's not really true. They actually tend to be pretty supportive. But again, there is this idea that may be a barrier. Again, number 3 will be financial, which I'll leave for Dr. Rosen to touch on. I'm realizing that I got to move quicker. Speaking of which, the 4th barrier is time, right? Right on cue, right? Time. I think we all know that the Orthodox lifestyle of the typical family is insane. Insane in the best way. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, but it is tremendously stressful in terms of timing, right? We were all talking, I think right, a bunch of us were already talking about how we almost missed our own panel because of the carpool, right? So you got carpool and you have after school activities and you have holidays and you have Shabbos and you have so many different expectations that we have for the most beautiful of reasons. And I'm not suggesting otherwise. I think it's wonderful and it's beautiful and it's what actually helps our mental health in many ways. But also, it makes any additional commitment of 45 minutes a week. Like, it's only 45 minutes a week. You're like, that's 45 minutes a week, right? Like, that's huge. That's huge. So I actually think that time as well is a barrier. So real quick, we'll run through these also. I think I have like 3.5 minutes left. Some ways to overcome. If I go a few minutes over, you could just detract from my questions, which is fine because I feel more confident with what I've prepared than asking questions. So, okay. So overcoming some of these barriers. So in terms of the stigma, as I mentioned, I think we've come a long way. I think the next step really is things like this, right? Forums, panels, conversations in which we talk openly about the struggles of mental health. Now, some people talk about their own struggles of mental health, and if they're comfortable doing so, that's a beautiful thing. But even if not, right, even just talking about mental health, if we could get rabbis to speak, whether it's publicly or private, right, I would encourage, I can tell you, I haven't met a rabbi yet who totally doesn't agree with the field of mental health. Yes, you'll have different views of how that manifests and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. But the concept that there is a concept of therapy, there is a concept of mental health, there is a concept that this is important for our success, for menuchas hanefesh, as we call it, right? To be able to live that life is absolutely a way in which we can overcome that barrier. If someone comes to you and it comes up talking about this, stigma of mental health, encourage them to talk to their rabbinic authorities, to talk to their schools, because that can go a long way. Oftentimes, what the leaders actually believe and what the community thinks the leaders believe don't always align. And so finding that way of communication can definitely go a long way for the barrier. There's another private clinician who told me a story that they were meeting with them, and this is not to upwards toward, but the idea is the same, right? That told them that they were in therapy, and it took them a long time to get into therapy. And what enabled them to be willing to go to therapy, they said, well, the stuff that things like Upward, or the Chicago Center, JCFS, all these organizations are doing in terms of being out there with education, with programming, talking about it, seeing people from within our community really talk openly that, look, this is something real. This is something that you are still a wonderful person, right? That all of these areas go a long way in terms of reducing the stigma. In terms of the religious limitations, so Again, also speaking with leaders, oftentimes if someone, like that example I gave with the religious scrupulosity, person who's hesitant to go because what's that going to impact, right? So Rav Asher Weiss, who's a major rabbinic authority in Israel, penned a response to such a student who was struggling with this religious scrupulosity and basically saying, you are totally wasting your time. You are not doing what God wants, right? And if you go to the rabbinic authorities, oftentimes they will explain to you that not only does going to therapy most often not negatively impact your spiritual or your religious observance, but actually quite the opposite. And how many people religious observance are minimized and are worse because of the fact that they are tremendously anxious or depressed or whatever it may be, right? Oftentimes having that conversation with a rabbinic authority actually does exactly the opposite. And also something to keep in mind, personally as a clinician, I do this all the time, right? Including those people's rabbis or rabbinic authorities, spiritual leaders involved in the treatment process goes a huge way. Right, letting this person know, by the way, it's not just me and you, and right, you can sign a release, and we can have. I've had sessions with rabbis in the session, right? So it's important that we get this out there, this idea that therapy doesn't negatively impact our religious observance, but most often quite the opposite. And then in terms of, again, in terms of financial, the only thing I will say about the financial is that as a community, and hearing this from the rabbinic perspective as well, as a community, we are committed to helping the community and any individual's mental health. And so while hopefully you'll hear more about the specific resources that may be available, when one goes to their rabbi or their school or whoever it may be, right? There are enough resources out there, even if you don't know the exact resources, to be able to pull it together to make it happen. We have people who are committed to making this happen. I think that's an important message to get out there. And finally, right, in terms of time, it's true. And I certainly, thank God, I have 3 little kids, 1 on the way, 2 jobs, and my wife works full time, and we have no family here. I get the struggle of time. I do. I promise. And it's at the same time something, right? When there's a will, there's a way. Right? If we understand, someone once gave the example, it's like taking a nap. Who has time to take a nap? Nobody. But sometimes when you're so dead tired, you need to lie down for 10, 15, 20 minutes, and you make that up on the back end. And so the same thing is true when it comes to time to therapy, right? Yes, we don't have the time, true. And at the same time, if we make the time, we will somehow find that 45 minutes a week that we've invested actually enables a lot more energy, a lot more ability to be more successful with the time. And just a very practical note also, while my preference personally is not to do therapy over telehealth, it has also changed this piece tremendously. If one really needs help, and if one is really not going to get help because of the fact that they don't have enough time, well, at least present with them the option of telehealth that you can cut out all that commute time. And so it doesn't become an hour and a half or an hour and 15 minutes. It becomes really 45 minutes. And so that's a little bit of the barriers, a little bit how to overcome it. And one other resource I just said that I wanted to touch on also was friends, right? Why is friends a resource? Because when we talk about stigma, or we talk about time, we talk about many of these areas, your friend probably has a therapist too. And so when you go to your friend and you talk about how you can't make the time for a therapist, they'll probably say, I know, a year ago I had the same issue and it took me forever to get into therapy, and now I got into therapy, and I'm telling you, we have to do it. We have to make it work, and it's wonderful. So hopefully that's helpful. I know that there were a couple questions submitted, which I did take notes on, but I'll save that for the question and answer and pass the mic.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me to be here. So again, my name is Tamara Kushnir Groman. I'm a lawyer. I work for CJE SeniorLife. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about sandwich generation, older adults, and advanced care planning, because we're all dealing with this, right? That our parents are aging, and that's really hard. And we see struggles both for our clients who are adults, who are managing their children and their parents, and for people who are managing it themselves. I work with a lot of solo agers, people who self-identify as not having family or friends. And so how can we support individuals who are solo agers? So first I want to say, talking about advanced care planning in general can be hard because we talk about death and dying and illness and losing control, right? And talking about end-of-life care planning is not so hard for me personally. You see, my parents received their cemetery plots as a wedding gift from my grandparents. And this started actually a whole lifetime of dinner conversations. It was not uncommon for me growing up to have a dinner conversation about my parents' end-of-life care plans. So that's a bit about my background and my approach, which is that we can talk about hard things, right? And people who come see me know that we can talk about hard things. However, in addition to talking about hard things, there are additional barriers that we see specifically within the Orthodox community. So number one, what is advanced care planning? Advanced care planning is planning for the what ifs in life, right? What if I'm in a hospital and I can't make decisions for myself? What if I have cognitive decline and I can no longer write checks, right? What if I develop a debilitating illness, right, and can no longer have use of my hands? So we write documents called powers of attorney with the hope that we never have to use them, right? And sometimes thinking about it that way lets people in to writing these documents. And in addition, the focus on when you write these documents, the individual, known as the principal, right? The principal actually maintains control. Because if you don't choose for yourself who your decision maker is going to be, a court and a judge who don't know you are going to make that decision. So I'm going to talk about 3 specific barriers that I have seen to working with members of, or to have members of the Orthodox Jewish communities come to see me. And keep in mind, while there are many financial reasons that legal planning can be difficult, none of those apply to me because CJE offers free legal services to anyone age 60 plus. So the financial barriers are not a reason to not come see me. Number one, in superstitions and cultural barriers. I had a client tell me, I cannot buy a cemetery plot because if I do, I'll be in it. And I said, well, someday you'll be in it anyway. And so it's okay if you buy it now. That's not actually how it works. But the idea of the evil eye, the Ayin Hara, you might hear someone say, oh, you know, I have 3 children, bli Ayin Hara, right? That if I say something that is positive about my life, I need to mitigate it or surround it with some kind of protection so that the evil eye will not come and harm that which is good in my life. Now, you might hear this phrase in a few different ways because the Yiddish will sound more like K.I.N.S, and then some people shorten it to Kinahora. Okay. Now I mention all those words because if you work with clients in the Orthodox community, you are going to hear those words. And sure enough, I hear them a lot because I say, what if? Oh my gosh, we can't even talk about that. What if, what if? And certain communities, even within Orthodoxy, for example, the community of native Russian speakers in our community are particularly sensitive and have particular intense superstitions when it comes to talking about illness and death. And you might even hear someone say something like, oh, you know, what if I get sick? Poo, poo, poo. And it sounds funny when I say it now, but it is a very sensitive cultural issue. So we need to always think about who is this person in the room with us. We all have thoughts and notions developed about death and dying, right? We've all had some kind of experience, right? Remembering that. So we have to bring that in. So we can't just say, oh, go talk to a lawyer about advanced care planning. Oh my gosh, I remember when there was probate, or I remember when there was a fight in the hospital, right? So recognizing all those things. The word hospice can trigger people in every which way. And I'm going to get more into Jewish law in a minute, but the word hospice can trigger some people to calm, quiet music and flowers and looking at trees and nature. And for other people, it can be hospice. They kill people there. And really, both of those, right, are based on your experience. So those are some of the cultural barriers. Next, I want to talk about misconceptions, commonly held misconceptions. Number one, Judaism doesn't allow a person to come off a ventilator ever under any circumstances. Well, we all know that when people speak in black and white, it's probably not so accurate. Now, I am not a rabbi. I am not here to give Jewish law guidance. You'll see in a few minutes, when I talk about what we can do, the answer is to bring the rabbi into the conversation, but I'll get there in a minute. There's also the misconception that in Judaism, every individual must seek every possible treatment. Well, again, black and white statements are generally not quite as accurate. The problem is we often talk about these things, right? When we talk in generalities, right? Talking about ventilators looks one way. When we talk about this specific patient in a hospital right now, right? Then we get into all the nuance. The other misconception is that talking about powers of attorney means talking about death. And I gotta say, if you come see me in my office, we talk about life. We talk about what is meaningful to me. If my agent has to make a choice for me, what choice do I want them to make? How do I want to live my life? The next barrier I want to talk about is family dynamics. Yeah, got a little murmur from the audience there. So a few things that specifically affect working with older adults and sandwich generation. Children and parents often have a different hashkafa. So the Hebrew word hashkafa talking about a religious outlook or religious identity. And this is true even within Orthodoxy, right? That people could fall, even when a person says, oh, I'm Orthodox, that is still a broad range of belief. And certainly when you're talking about true end-of-life care, the different spectrums in Orthodoxy could produce different answers to what we should do right now. So one thing I want to say is, you don't have to name your kids in your documents. There's no obligation to have family do this, right? So, but there is just this idea that you have to know that even when kids and parents are both Orthodox, let alone when either kids or parents are not, that is going to be a barrier to what I want and whether this individual can do for me what I want as far as my care plan. I had a family in my office who did not want to disclose to me that the child who they were raising was actually the stepchild of one of the parents. And I said, listen, nothing goes beyond this room, but I need to write legally what the relationship is among all these people. Because if we don't write it legally now, it gets challenged in court later. So the idea that a family could be raising a child from another family, right? Or it's a stepchild, all the different variations of who that is, right? And we might want to keep that quiet, right? We're a very insular community. However, when you talk to your lawyer, you got to tell them all the details. Finally, I do want to talk about finances, but in a slightly different way. The Orthodox Jewish lifestyle is an expensive one. Finances may be messier than we'd like to disclose. There are many parents who support their children, sometimes to their own financial detriment. And now, right, grandma and grandpa have been supporting mom and dad, right, for years, for 20 years. But now grandma and grandpa need support. And now they have to disclose what the finances really are. and the house is mortgaged and the credit card debt is exceeding what's possible to pay off. But now we have to think about long-term care or help in the home and who can pay for it. So coming to talk to a lawyer about finances and unwinding some of these financial problems and making a plan for working on these finances and how do we manage this, right, can then help create a system, right, to go forward. But there's, a fear if one of us needs nursing care, it will bankrupt us. And then what does bankruptcy actually mean? And can I file bankruptcy? So all of these questions are particularly relevant in our Orthodox communities when we're trying to pay for day school and homes and synagogue dues and give charity, right? And do all of the different areas that we're trying to do. So what do? We got a lot of problems. What do? Number one, I would say, get the rabbi involved. Get the rabbi involved. So if you have a client who is saying to you, oh, mom is getting this care and I don't think we can stop it, or we can't take off the ventilator and I'm so overwhelmed, and right? I think most of the people here are in the role of clinicians, right? You as the therapist aren't going to be able to change the mind of the person. However, you can invite the person to bring in the community rabbi and ask the question. And when people say, well, but the rabbi's so busy, I don't want to bother the rabbi, right? This is what our community rabbis do. Make an appointment, call. This isn't something we want to necessarily discuss on Shabbat at Kiddush, right? When everybody's around, but call and make an appointment, right? So you have to involve that. And sometimes people say, I don't want to talk to my rabbi about it. It's too embarrassing. Okay. Well, which community group do you belong to? Would you like to speak to another rabbi affiliated with the CRC or the Aguda, right? Who else is in your community who you could speak to? There are differences in Jewish law regarding things like medical procedures and removing ventilators and things like that. However, the two major Jewish rulings both agree that if there is a writing, if the patient has written down what it is they want, then that is an important consideration, right? So having these conversations early is so important to getting the outcomes that you hope for. And the other thing is in a role, I mean, I'm not a clinician, but you never dismiss the authoritative role of the rabbi in the community, right? I actually, personal story, once had a therapist say to me, well, do you have to do Shabbat every week? And to be honest, the relationship ended there because that was a person who didn't understand me, right? So do you really have to do everything the rabbi says, right? Instead, bring that rabbi into the conversation. And others, right? So at organizations like CJE, we've got social workers, we've got care managers, we've got benefit specialists, right? We can all work together to support an individual getting the outcome that they want. Next, there are lawyers, not just me, others in the community, who are sensitive to the halachic, to the Jewish law needs of care planning, right? There is the halachic version, the Jewish law version of a power of attorney for healthcare. There is a Jewish law version of a last will and testament, right? And many of us have been trained on how to complete these documents for the benefit of all the clients. So, and those clients who say to me, well, I'm not sure my rabbi is really going to like this. Let's prep the documents and then you take them to your rabbi. That's okay with me. Let's all work together. Finally, who will be your allies? Right? That's a huge question. Who are your allies in tackling this? Right? So there could be the community synagogue rabbi, the rabbi from yeshiva. There are many other compassionate social service workers, right, who can be part of your team. And then I don't want to discount the role of chaplains. It is such an imperative role that I think isn't always fully understand. How can a chaplain help me and guide me through this process? And we could spend a whole hour just talking about chaplaincy, but we're not going to do that. But the idea is think about who all the different players are who can be on your team, and then gather your allies and then proceed.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming and having me speak. Thank you, Rabbi Bresler and Tamara and Dr. Rosen. So I was, as you were doing your introduction, I was just thinking about what you said about that you grew up in a family where you could always discuss death. I'm a son of Holocaust survivors, so that was always on the table. So I can relate. So some of the things that I'm gonna bring up are issues that had been discussed by Rabbi Bresler and will probably be discussed by Dr. Rosen as well. But just a little history. I have a private practice here in the community. I only see people in the community. And when I first started working at Jewish Child and Family Services, I had a barrier. Okay. I'd worked for a child abuse agency for 26 years, and that was always the presenting problem. And I always remember that I had a father come in and say to me, I was furious at his son, and I was like, okay, let's talk about this. I said, what happened? And he was like, well, he's in 8th grade, and it was May. It was this time of year, and he and a whole bunch of kids, they left school. And I'm like, okay. And they went down to the lake, and I was like, okay. And I'm just like waiting for him to tell me something horrible that happened at the lake. Like, what did they do? Did they abuse somebody down to the lake? And I said, what'd they do? Well, they sat in the sun and they just talked. And it was sort of like, okay, you need to change your mindset a little bit, because this isn't what life is all about. It's not only about abuse. So it was sort of, for me, it was an eye opener. So I think I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the barriers, and Rabbi Bresler brought up the issue of stigma. And I do want to say that in the 40 some odd years that I have been involved with the Jewish community, we have made huge, ginormous strides in helping families deal with issues of abuse, all types of abuse, issues of what is mental health all about. We have an agency here called now No Shame on You. I mean, they do unbelievable work about letting everybody know how this is just a part of life, and there is a way for all of us to get through it. But I think one of the biggest barriers, and I still find this, is like, what are other people going to think? Unfortunately, in my clinical time, I have had times I've had to call DCFS, okay? And so often I hear from families, what are the neighbors going to think if they see a DCFS worker coming to my house? Now, the first thing I think in my head is, most DCFS workers don't have DCFS, labeled on their head, like so it's sort of like, it's all really very internal. And it's sort of like, how do you get somebody to be able to accept the help that we as a Jewish community are going to give you, because there's a problem in your family and they really have a big deal. We really, really have a big hard time about that. And as a community, many years ago, we had somebody at DCFS that if there was something happening within the Jewish community, that person would be called because they understood Shabbat and Yom Tov. So I had a family where, unfortunately, we had to call DCFS, and DCFS showed up 5 minutes before candlelighting on a Friday night. Okay. And the mom goes, no. You can't. Anyway, it was a whole big issue because this DCFS worker had no idea what was going on, and she just felt that the parents weren't letting them in and talking to the kids, whatever. And she was going to call the police. Okay, so we got involved, and we were able to calm things down. But we did realize that what we needed to do is to find somebody within DCFS he could be that person who we would call and say, we have an issue. It's 20 minutes before candlelighting on Yom Tov. Can we have somebody come in a day or two? Because right now the child the elder person, whoever it is not in any danger. Okay, so we've really stepped up as far as that goes. But again, part of the stigma is, what are other people going to think because of this? One of the big barriers that we have in our community is the wait list. Okay, we don't have, as Rabbi Bresler said, there are not enough Jewish Orthodox clinicians in this community. We just don't have enough. Okay, and I will speak for our access team. I cannot tell you how many times we get a phone call where parents say, I only want my child, or I only want to see an Orthodox clinician. Okay, in my office, we have myself and we have my supervisor, the person who is supervising other people. We are the only two Orthodox people in the office. Okay, and neither one of us carries a full caseload. Okay, so a lot of times what it entails is psychoeducation. And I'm really big on psychoeducation because it's really important for people to understand that just because you are religious does not necessarily mean that the issues that you're calling about need to be dealt with a religious clinician. I had many, many years ago, I was seeing somebody, and my being religious was a detriment to the therapy, because this gentleman thought he could use all of the Yiddish and all of the Hebrew, and he could throw things out. I do teshuvah, I do repentance, and I sent him over to a non-Jewish therapist where he had to explain everything. He couldn't say, oh, I went to shul on Shabbos, because the therapist would go, what's a shul? I have no idea what you're talking about. And what do you do there? So sometimes I psychoeducate parents that it's not always, it doesn't have to be a religious therapist. Okay. Sometimes, especially for adults, it gets really important for them to be able to explain things and talk about things. I'll give you an example of the stigma. I'll go back to that for a minute, where I had clients who came to see me and they called the access team, and they called because they wanted couples counseling. Great. Okay. I got to sign the case. Perfect. Make the phone call. They don't want to have anything to do with couples counseling. They have a kid who they need to be seen. And I was like, okay, well, why didn't you bring that up? Oh, we didn't want to tell the access worker that we had a problem with our child. And it was easier for them to say we're having a marital issue than to say they have a problem with their child. So I spent a lot of time on the phone with this mom doing some psychoeducation about what this is all about. Like, if you're having a problem with your child, that may be a little bit connected to what's going on between you and your husband, but she wasn't really in a place to hear that as yet. So I find that also, because we have a long wait list at Jewish Child and Family Services, you can talk to parents, I find, and get them to understand that just because your child is not going to see a religious therapist, it doesn't mean he's not going to get good therapy. One of the things that I have learned in our community, and again, I give so much credit to the institutions that are doing this, is dealing with boys and girls who are 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. And lots of times the barrier there is that their parents are so afraid that, well, their issues of maturity and puberty and everything else, that can only come from an Orthodox therapist. Okay. Not true. Okay. It's I can talk to my people who I supervise about how to deal with this, but it's really a lot of just getting the parents comfortable, because if you can get a parent comfortable with the therapist that they're seeing, they can deal with whatever they want to deal with. Okay. One of the big barriers that I've always come upon is boundaries. We live, as Rabbi Bresler said, we live in a big community. It is so small. Okay. I was talking to Mr. Adler before about, he works for the Chicago Chesed Fund, helping people get jobs. And he's amazed at how everybody knows everybody else, and that's really, really the way it is. And there's really not even sometimes it's black and white, sometimes it's gray. I had a young man, he was in, I would say about 6th grade. and he lived in the community. And I said to him, one of my first questions is, at the end of my session is, the first session is, so how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to deal with seeing each other? You live a block away. We're going to see each other on the street. Okay. I say to people, we're going to see each other in Jewel. We're going to see each other in Shul. How are we going to deal with this? This kid said to me, looked me straight in the eye. Great eye contact. That I remember. And he said, this is what's going to happen. And I'm like, okay. And he says, you see me coming down the street. You are going to cross the street until I pass you. When I pass you, you can come back on the other side of the street. And I'm like, okay, no problem. 2 weeks later, he's coming down the street. Okay. I cross over. He passes by. I go over. It was so life-changing for this kid because, wow, you heard what I said. You actually did what I wanted to do. Okay. Whereas you have other people who are like, I saw somebody who in one of the shuls I davened in, he sat behind me in shul and I said to him, so how do you want to handle this? How are we going to do this? You sit behind me, can I turn, what do I do? He says, everything you've always done. You say good Shabbos to me. You say hello to me. You treat me as a human being. Nobody knows I'm coming to see you. So what's the big deal? Okay. Sometimes, especially with adults, those boundaries are a big problem. And for those of us who are working within the Jewish community, believe me, you go to a wedding, you go to a bar mitzvah, they find you, they want to talk to you. And thank goodness my wife is like, no, call them at the office. Bye. And she takes me by the arm and we walk away. Okay. But boundaries is a really big problem. We've had, when not necessarily in the office I work in now, but when I used to work at the Peterson office of JCFS, we had clients who used to want to come up the back stairs. They did not want to sit in the waiting room. They didn't want to be seen by anybody else. And we had a set of back stairs and we would meet them in the office and they would never have to get, I would pick up the phone and call and tell the front desk, by the way, my 4 o'clock client is here. He's sitting with me, or she's sitting with me. She's sitting with me. So that still is an issue. How do people figure out where to sit in the waiting room when you get off the elevator at at the NAP Center? When you get off the elevator and you walk into the waiting room and there's somebody there, how does a kid deal with if they're seeing their teacher there? Okay, I've had kids tell me, I can't do this. I'm not coming back. I know him and he knows me, and I don't want anybody to know that. So the boundaries that we have to set for our clients is really something that we work very hard with. As far as the psychoeducation in our community, it has been phenomenal. When back at the beginning of the 1990s, when our community was dealing with an issue of sexual abuse, there was very little psychoeducation that went on in the community. Now we have get-togethers for parents to talk about it. The schools are very involved. There are many programs. There's a SMART program, if I'm not mistaken. Am I right? Is that what it's called? There's a SMART program where they go into the schools. So we really have come a huge distance. However, the barrier is that there still are people in our community who feel that things that like puberty and maturity and sexuality are not things that should be discussed. Okay, and I had a young man many years ago who grew up in a very Orthodox family, and there was no discussion about anything that was going on with him as he matured. And he came in once and he started telling me what a horrible person he is, because he has dreams, and he was a normal 14, 15-year-old kid. Okay. And I remember going out to his mom after the session and saying to her, anybody ever talk to your son about this? And she was like, no. And I said, is it okay if I do? And she was like, oh, please, thank you so much. or even the barrier where there is one of our day schools where one of the clinicians, he is a clinician, talks to all of the boys about maturity and sexuality, but it has to be done with parental permission. And even to this day, there are parents who say, no, I don't want it. Okay, I don't want my son. And he doesn't do it as a class. He does it individually, each one of the boys. Okay. He and I have had discussions about, well, what happens to these boys who don't get this discussion? All they want to do is talk about it with their class because they go over, what do you say? What do you say? What do you say? What do you say? And boys don't always hear everything the right way. And going back to my own history, but anyway, that's another part of the stigma and part of the what happens in our community. But again, if when I stop and think about the fact that this school has somebody who actually that they've approved somebody to sit down and talk to these boys, that is a huge, ginormous leap in our community. I like to talk to parents also, because you'd be amazed. One of the first things I ask kids when they come in, and they say, what did your parents tell you about today? Today's our first session. We're going to be, talking together for a while. What did your parents tell you? Okay. I get everything from nothing to you're going to an appointment to parents who actually say, we want you to talk to, Ed about whatever it is. Okay. So I find it so important to psychoeducate parents about what therapy is. Okay. About what is going to happen. Okay. And I always tell parents, you need to promise me something, that when your child comes home, you are not going to sit your child down and say, no, what did you talk about? That's not okay. Okay. And parents are like, but I want to know. And I would say, well, then you come to me. Then you come and you talk to me about it. Okay. And so many people in our community don't understand what therapy is. Okay. Even once their kids are in it, or even once they're in it. I mean, I had a young man who is, and he actually sat down with me our second or third session and said, so explain this to me. Help me understand, like, what are you trained in? What do you do? So I explained to him about the CBT I do and the EMDR I do and the trauma I do and all this other kind of stuff. And he said to me, so he wanted to understand how that was all going to apply to him. Okay. And that's what I love to talk to parents about it. Simply because if they're going to be able to, a parent and a child, if they're going to be able to help their kid, they need to understand what's going on in that office. Okay. And for the children, of course, and I'm sure maybe you might even touch on that, how important it is for them to know that when they walk out of my office, because this is their thought, okay, they're going to walk out of the office and Eddie, I know what you're going to do. You're going to pick up the phone and you can tell my parents everything I just said, and really getting them to understand that that's not what it's about. And to end, I'm going to go back to something that a supervisor once told me many years ago, especially dealing with kids in our community, that I had a lot of toys out in my office, and I would say to him, this is back when I was working with JCFS kids, and I had kids who used to come in and they played with every single toy. And when they left, it took me half an hour just to clean up and figure out which sorry piece goes in there. Okay. So I talked with my supervisor, and he said to me, you need to understand that kids in general, the only time they get to go into an office and speak to an adult is when they've done something wrong. Nobody gets called into the principal's office where they say, by the way, I got to tell you, you're doing a really good job today. That's not really happening. Okay. So when they come into your office, they have no idea what to do. They have not a clue, because when they get called into the principal's office, they got to be, okay, now they're just going to sit there and they're going to wait to get their heads handed to them. So part of that is just being able to even educate the kids that this is your time, this is your hour. And that was for me, it was a really enlightening thing to do. And I'm going to hand the microphone over because I've just got the sign from David. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Marni.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Marni Rosen, and I am so appreciative of my colleagues up here and their experience. I want to kind of contextualize myself a little bit. I'm actually the newest person to working in the Orthodox community. I've only been in my position for about a year and a half. I have been working in nonprofit management prior to this experience, to my position. I was hired by the Chicago Center to build the outpatient behavioral health clinic at Midwest Refuah Health Center. And what the Chicago Center, the role I have there is I work at the Chicago Hope Program, helping with mental health referrals. And I am the clinical director of the outpatient services for mental health. And in these two roles have really helped me see and experience some of these barriers with the Orthodox community that I want to get into from more an administrator before the clinical portion, because I think there's something beneficial about us understanding the larger, bigger barriers that maybe we're not talking about as and addressing as much in that way. So I want to talk about the financial barriers, the insurance barriers, the bigger things that we have trouble getting our community into services on a very basic level. So the Chicago Center was one of the first centers outside of the health hospital to provide vaccines during COVID. And during that time, they provided vaccination to a good portion of the Orthodox community. And I took data. They collected health insurance. I took data from that vaccine clinic, and about 40% of the Orthodox community is on a federal or state insurance. That is a significant part of our community that is underinsured. So that means for mental health services, we're talking about a big portion of our community that has to use a state benefited facility for insurance. And when we talk about having Orthodox providers for Orthodox clients, we're talking a tremendously limited number of organizations that hire Orthodox providers. So JCFS, Midwest Refuah, Upwards, which has a sliding scale, there are very few agencies that take Medicaid that have Orthodox providers. So that is an exceptionally limiting barrier for a lot of our clients. So then we're talking about trying to access a sliding scale, right? And when we talk about sliding scales, as someone who has built the sliding scale for Midwest Refuah, our families do not meet the poverty guidelines. They do not qualify for the federally qualified health center guidelines. They do not. Even with families of 12, I'm telling you, they do not meet because their incomes are higher, but they have a large number of children. Because our cost of living is so high, they still can't afford the cost of services on a weekly basis. Because the cost of, for example, like chicken in the Orthodox community. So when we had that like the flu, for the chicken flu or whatever, and the cost of chicken went up for non-kosher food to what, $1.99 a pound for non-kosher chicken. It was like $6.99 for kosher chicken. It is a tremendous influx for kosher food. And then when you have different levels of kosher food, which people don't realize. So there's even different types of milk products, and that raises the cost for families to a tremendous amount. So if you have a younger child who drinks milk, there is a higher level of kosher for that milk product. So if you're buying that level of milk, it is $5 to $6 for a gallon of milk. So it's a tremendous barrier just from the standpoint of kosher food. And then when you talk about Jewish education, the tuition bills that they pay annually for their education when you have 12 children that you're putting through school. This is a tremendous financial constraint for the idea of paying for a weekly session. So even if we have a generous sliding scale, which Upwards provides a tremendously generous sliding scale, the idea of paying $50 a week, that's still $200 a month. That is a tremendous amount of money for one child. And then if you have multiple children with issues, if you have a kid with special needs, those bills just continue to escalate, right? And that's our families with Medicaid. The other position that we have in the Jewish community is a tremendous number of families with HMOs. And this is the underinsured that people don't talk about. HMOs is a tremendous barrier for families for mental health because you're choosing your health care, your physical health care over your mental health care. So the HMO networks, there are very few to no providers in the HMOs. As someone who does referrals, you're very lucky to find any providers for mental health services in the HMOs. But I'll tell you what they provide really well. You can have a baby and pay $300 for your entire delivery. So if you have a family of 12, what are you going to choose? I would choose the HMO, right? Because you don't have to pay anything to have a baby every year, right? So when you have an Orthodox family who's devoted to family life, you're going to choose the insurance that's financially going to be more suited to you because you're not thinking about mental health when you think about delivery of children and the cost of that process, right? So this is the financial constraints that we're talking about and getting people into mental health service just from the idea of what they can afford to help out their family. The other part that I want to talk about is medication management. So another part of the community is not just the therapy portion that we're dealing with, but how do we deal with it when they need medications? So we have obviously in the community, we know beyond just the Jewish community, there is a tremendous lack of providers for psychiatry and medication management. So when you throw in what we know also about insurance, right? So we're limiting that even further, correct? So we have a medication management grant in the Orthodox community for children. So if you don't know about that program, please reach out to me. I'm happy to talk through that program. But even that has barriers, which we realized we had a good chunk of money for that grant that we are having trouble giving away that money. Isn't that not shocking? Like, what is that about, right? We realized that families didn't want to disclose to the school because it had to come from the schools. The referral had to come from the schools first. Didn't want the schools to know that their children were having issues that possibly needed to be medicated, and they didn't want them to know that it was happening. So people were coming to me privately to see the same provider that was on the grant but didn't want it to be paid for by the grant. They would rather pay out of pocket when we just talked about the financial barriers.
Ironically, the schools know that those kids are having problems.
But they don't want it to be known that they're being medicated because of the stigma. So this is some of the barriers that we're dealing with is the idea that the stigma behind medication management, because all of a sudden you're taking it to also a new level. Because the idea that taking medication means something that's really at a different level. However, there are certain diagnoses that are more accepted. So I want to kind of also separate that. So for some reason, ADHD has less stigma. So medication management for ADHD, that's a little bit easier. Anxiety, but when we head into depression and mood disorders, that has more stigma. And for when we talk about bipolar, when we get into those diagnoses, then we have a lot of barriers. When we have externalizing disorders, those have more stigma. But the executive functioning, internalizing disorders, those they are more comfortable with medicating and more comfortable with therapy from what I have seen. So I'll talk a little bit about crisis because that question came up and because I deal with referrals. So the referral program doesn't just get referrals for what you would think of the outpatient. So what happens in our referral program is they come to us and they say, well, we're having this issue. We need medication management. He needs to be seen tomorrow. And we're like, okay, well, that's just not going to happen. Tell us what's going on. Well, he came in from New York. We just flew him back in. He's in the middle of a manic episode. We're like, okay, this is not medication management. This is crisis. So what ends up happening in a lot of our experience with our referral program is that families, because of the stigma, are delaying help until we get to the point of crisis. So then they don't even necessarily know they're at a level of crisis because they don't actually know what they're looking at. So some of our referral program is actually helping them figure out what level of care we're actually talking about. And they don't even know what levels of care exist because they are not informed about what's out there in mental health, because they're not experienced with any of the levels of care until they're already in the system. And then they know. And sometimes have done multiple rounds of different types of treatment. However, when it's their first time, they don't know what an IOP or PHP is. So they don't even think to start with outpatient or to think about that level until we're also talking about inpatient. One of the things that's the hardest thing when we talk about with parents is what hospital and where, because of the concerns and fears of what they're going to be exposed to, especially with teens and with children, and especially when we talk about Medicaid. So one of the things at Chicago Hope that we really work hard about is knowing what hospitals where have what knowledge of the Orthodox community. We know the liaisons, we know what population they have, we have the connections with all of them, and we figure out who to send them where. And we have certain hospitals that we prefer. We try not to send by ambulance. We try to control where they're being sent. We try to meet them in the emergency room. I mean, this is how much work we do for our Orthodox clients, because we know where they go is so important to the families. So we are in the emergency room or speaking to the crisis worker on the floor, trying to help them figure out what inpatient unit or what PHP IOP they're going to, so that the family feels comfortable with the decision. So much so our reputation has become that people from out of town are calling us to fly in from different cities to figure out where to go. Because this is how the Orthodox community works, is they want to know, can you get them kosher food in their program? Do they understand Shabbat? Will they be able to talk to them and understand that this client this teenager knows nothing about sex, knows nothing about gender identity, knows nothing about these issues. So if you put them in a program with a bunch of teens, can they handle it? That's what they're worried about. That's their fear. They've never been exposed to a person of color. Their schools are very, very, very insulated. So if we send them to a program in the city where they are the only white child, they feel very scared. And it's only because they've not been exposed. They don't know any different. So the parents are terrified. And for adults too, they don't really know. They've not been exposed either. So we figure out with them what their comfort level is and where we can send them. And there are certain hospitals that work with us and there are certain hospitals that don't. So that is, when we talk about crisis, it's really a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous amount of conversation before we even send them to the hospital. I think the thing that we work with most, and probably the most helpful thing in terms of this work and the barriers, is the collaboration between these kinds of agencies and knowing who to call when and what services we have where. So for example, like working with the ARC, and look at Samantha Spolter over here, because we talk about different clients, about different resources for covering therapy in different ways. The Chesed Fund does different types of covering for neuropsych reporting. So does REACH. Like we have grant programs in different places to help with the barriers of insurance and cost. Medication management with REACH, we work with Upwards for referrals on that as well, so we can have direct communication for some of our cases. So if you have Orthodox clients, sometimes the best thing to work with is to reach out to us directly about how to access the different resources we already have and not to recreate services. And Chicago Hope has a list of referrals in all of these different areas.
I just wanted to piggyback on something that you said about medication. Clinically, we have found that parents are reluctant to go to a psychiatrist, but not so reluctant to ask their pediatricians if the kids have let's say ADHD, or the parents walk in and they say to the pediatrician, oh, this is what, blah, blah, you know, my kid needs ADHD medication. And unfortunately, there are a lot of pediatricians who are going to hear what the parents are saying and not necessarily sit down with the kid and see whether or not this is true. But we still have quite a number of families in our community who just push the medication away. And I said to a family a number of years ago, I said, so help me understand. So your kid, you know, the teachers, he spends most of his time outside the classroom. The teachers can't handle him. You know, recess is just a mess. And as a clinician, by the way, when I go do observations, I think recess is one of the best places to go and watch what's going on for kids. It's just amazing. But anyway, so I said to the parents, so help me understand, if you got a call from the teacher who said, I think your kid needs glasses because I have to put him all the way in the front, and even sitting in the front, he can't see what's written on the board. I said, would you not take your kid to the eye doctor and get him a pair of glasses? Oh, of course. How could you even think that I wouldn't do that? And I said, well, this is the same thing. I said, this is medication, which is going to chemically help your child be able to focus, increases his executive functioning, everything else. And they were like, oh. And so they sat and they thought about it, and they still didn't take him to the psychiatrist.
Thank you to our speakers. There were some questions that were shared in advance, and I wonder if anyone would like to address it further, or if we've touched on it already. How do attitudes towards outside services change during? Pardon? So here are some questions that were asked initially. How do attitudes toward outside services change during crises? Dr. Rosen, you talked about families showing up during crises. Do you feel you addressed that fully, or would you like to add?
I think sometimes we can educate families that when there's a crisis, to seek outside the Orthodox community based on their, you know, and insurance isn't allowing them to get into providers, and sometimes still not. I got a call just the other day, being from a social worker at the school, who said to me, can you push this kid in faster? They're in crisis at school. And I said, no, they're on a wait list. I explained to the parent they cannot get in faster. And the teacher was like, well, I don't know what to do. I told the parent they needed to be seen immediately. And I said, would you have told the parent to maybe not be on the wait list? I don't, you know, like, I don't know how to, but the parent is insisting that they be seen by this exact provider. And so, like, I think sometimes they still aren't willing, even when they're hearing that there's a crisis, to escalate to different providers, but some parents are more amenable. And I think it's a case by case situation to shift to outside providers who are not Orthodox. I think when there's a very big crisis, when they see that they're decompensating, we can get them to the hospital, but it's usually the in-betweens to IOP, PHP first that I don't see as easily.
I just want to add something that this waiting till crisis mode happens across service spectrums. If someone calls me and says, I missed a mortgage payment, right? I don't know what to do. I lost a job, this, that, or the other happened. I missed a mortgage payment. There's a lot we can do at a first missed mortgage payment, even a second, even once the foreclosure has started. But the person who calls me and says the sheriff put a 24-hour notice on my door, right? And now I need help. There is nothing I can do, right? I can do a lot with advanced care planning, but not when someone calls me and says, mom needs to go into a nursing home tomorrow and she's not decisional and I need a power of attorney. Okay, well, head to guardianship court, and there's nothing else that we can do. So it's across areas of need, right? There's a lot we can do to get a person on SNAP benefits when there's food insecurity, right? And try to minimize that. There are agencies that offer financial assistance for that crisis. Oh my gosh, I went to the store with my SNAP card and there was no money left on it, right? There are ways we can get that person kosher food today, right? But the bigger picture of let's work on this, right? The sooner we get involved, right? The better we can manage all of the things before we get to crisis.
I just want to add a very quick point to that as well, which is I think that all obviously ties into what we've all spoken about, which is the bottom line is we have a beautiful life in the Orthodox community and family. All of these barriers are by means of the Orthodox lifestyle is also very rigorous and demanding. All these kind of play into each other. And I think at the bottom line is that as a community, we do come together. We do have the resources there, which to me is kind of the silver lining, which is that when crisis hits, and yes, all too often do we wait till crisis happens, sometimes because we don't realize the problems are coming, sometimes because we're negligent, and oftentimes because we're always dealing on crisis because we're dealing with what's today's crisis and we can't get to the other crisis before crisis does hit. So I do think that's just a reality also that is important to play into our lives ahead of time. But I do find also that when crisis hits, that yes, there are certainly, I agree with Dr. Rosen, there's certainly still many families and in many areas that despite crisis hitting won't be open to certain elements. At the same time, I do find that many of the barriers that I spoke about do somewhat ease up. For instance, when the stigma, right, when there's a real crisis, oftentimes families are more willing to seek help. When there's a real crisis, oftentimes families are understanding of, okay, I got to prioritize this, or I have to really reach out to my rabbi that I was so hesitant to reach out to before, and are able to come to that because, yes, I do believe that when crisis does hit, oftentimes those attitudes towards those services do change.
And I think that one of the important things that we try to talk to parents about is the importance of being involved. Let's say you have a child who's in treatment, the importance of being involved, because if you can continue to have the parents involved, then hopefully when there's a crisis, they know who to turn to. It's, many years ago, I went to a seminar, and it was a family therapy seminar, and somebody got up and said something which I always remind parents about. And he said, our clinic is not a dry cleaners. I tell this to the parents first session, this guy said, we are not a dry cleaners. You don't come here once a week, drop your kid off and pick him up after an hour and expect them to be all better. If you're not involved, tell us now and we'll find you someplace else to be. So I think if we can work on the stigma, the barriers to get the parents to really be involved in their kids' treatment, not just to drop the kid off and come pick them up after an hour, that when there's a crisis, they know who to turn to. We can become a resource for them.
Thank you. So a theme that a number of us have highlighted is that it's not necessary that members of the Orthodox communities need to have an Orthodox therapist, that services can be provided by non-Orthodox therapists. There was a question, and also we see in the last 10, 15, 20 years in Chicagoland, the rise of a number of organizations coming out of the Orthodox communities to address mental health issues along with other human service issues, and a number of us are here from those. So a question was asked about whether we have enough Orthodox employees working in the fields needed to reduce barriers, and if so, what can be done to encourage young Orthodox people to pursue careers in mental health. Any thoughts about that?
So, well, Midwest Refuah right now is we're working actually directly with a couple of the local schools to kind of increase pipeline directly. I think part of it is that there hasn't been a good presence for Orthodox schools here. So in New York, we have Yeshiva University and Turo, and there hasn't been as much strong presence. There is HTC, and there has been the girls' campus, I'm forgetting their TI. So Turo is actually growing their program here. And through those kinds of initiatives, I think that will strengthen the marketplace here for Orthodox clinicians. I think a lot of times what happens is that it is actually Orthodox programs that create Orthodox clinicians. So that I think is also part of it, is that we are not drawing as much from New York to Chicago as easily. And so now having a pipeline here, like Turo is starting a counseling at distance program. So that will hopefully help the pipeline here, as well as they're working with North Park for a nursing program. So hopefully more NPs. So there is some growing programs in our Orthodox community that will hopefully lend to some more providers locally. But I think that overall, I think part of it is also just more national market search to bring more clinicians from New York potentially here.
Can I ask a question on that?
Yes.
How many of the youth are coming back to Chicago? So a lot of the people that become clinicians or become nurses, how many of the young adults actually stay in Chicago, or do they move elsewhere, whether it's New York, New Jersey, or out of Chicago, which could be an issue to why we may not have so many clinicians here as well?
Obviously, we don't have statistics. I will just tell you anecdotally, I am from St. Louis, Missouri. Obviously, New York is New York. And New York is, as we all know, the center of the country that isn't really the center of the country. And what's Chicago and all of that? I don't mean to be ripping on New York. I spent 8 years in New York, love New York. I will say everything is relative. Again, this is not statistically based. But when I was growing up, and by growing up, I mean till like yesterday, my perception of Chicago people was that you're from Chicago, especially if you're a female from Chicago in the Orthodox community, very often you're moving back. That was always my perception. But again, this is, I'm sure those who grow up in Chicago have a different perception. So none of us have statistics, but I do think people are moving back. And just to add on one little point to the, by the way, when I mentioned at the beginning, right, my wife and I, that when we spoke about the time that we're not from here, we don't have family here. We do have a daughter, so I'm saying that also as a prayer. But I mean, hopefully she'll be in Israel, but one day. But in regards to also the question of, I think the answer, as we all have said multiple times, is no, we don't have enough. I think that's also true in every field right now. And I do think that I still think that within the Orthodox community in particular, social work, counseling, psychology is a relatively new field. And so I do think that that we're still at the beginning stages of saying, I think that if you speak to the average high school or college student, the field of social work or counseling is more on their radar than it was. And I think the best thing we can do for that is continue to be in contact with the schools, continue to do presentations like these in the schools. I know that recently our clinical director spoke on a professional panel in one of the girls' high schools about the field of counseling. The more we talk to them, we put it on their radar. I think that's the best thing that we can do.
I think another way that might be helpful is the transition of license time period is a really stressful time for clinicians when they move to another state and often can't find a job, or the place that hires them can't fully put a caseload. So I think that would be an opportunity for funding or a grant or something of that nature to, if we could ever come up with something in that transition period. So I just see that as a barrier that we could possibly find a solution for. So if we were to hire someone from New York, but they had to transition their license, that can take 3 to 6 months where they can't fully do services. And I think that would not be something we couldn't solve.
And I will just say that part of the problem that, I mean, as a hiring manager at JCFS, we don't see very many Orthodox clinicians coming in. I think the issue is also pay, and that if you're young married or you have a couple of kids, non-for-profits, it's hard to pay tuition. and buy kosher food and pay your membership dues and do everything else with what you're being paid by some of the agencies that are hiring. So that's it's compared to private practices, and that's what happens. I'm sorry.
We will have more questions, and Mr. Adler, I know you want to ask a question. So as we ask a question, please say your name and agency. I'm David Rosenberg, coordinator of Jewish Educational Services for JCFS and liaison for the agency for our work with the Orthodox community. Mr. Adler?
Thanks. Two observations. First of all, this panel is great. There's so many important things that the panel has brought up. My name is Abe Adler, as the director of Job Link within the Chicago Chesed Fund. This is enormously beneficial. But two observations that the panel touched on. In the more recent conversation, last few minutes, about clinicians, the problem's not trying to bring New Yorkers or people from Los Angeles or clinicians here. The problem is not just with clinicians, it's also with doctors, lawyers, accountants, anything that requires advanced education. There is a strong feeling amongst young adults right now, coming out of high school, even coming out of HTC or Blitzstein, they want to make quick money. They don't want to go through the long schooling. It's amazing that I can post available jobs with six-figure incomes in the accounting and finance field, and not a single person in the Chicago area will come back to me, except for people who are completely unqualified, but nobody who's actually in the field is available to apply for those jobs. And this is a comment across all the fields, because the importance of a vocation and a career that requires some early investment when you're young to go to school is important. Whether you're a clinician, a social worker, a lawyer, a doctor, an accountant, and I could go on and on and on, those things that require investments. You know what the kids are interested in? They're interested in becoming a realtor, a property manager, an asset manager, because my brother, my cousin, my uncle, my neighbor across the street, my chavrusa, they did it easily. And that's something that the entire community, and especially the leading rabbis, need to get a hold of, to start fixing this and influencing kids now in their young age. Not when they get to their late 20s and their early 30s, yeshiva couples who then hit all the roadblocks that you've mentioned, especially the financial one. The rabbis need to start changing this early on. It's an investment, it takes time. It's going to take 10 years. And the last point I'm going to mention, everybody on the panel mentioned about rabbis. The most influential person in every family in the community is their rabbi, not their friend, not their parents, not their uncle. What did the rabbi say? Is the rabbi going to approve this? So I think you all mentioned bringing the rabbi into the conversation early and having the rabbis really advocate that these avenues and these services are things that families need to take advantage now. It can be done discreetly, nobody else has to know, but they have to take a more leading role. They have to be part of this conversation. A rabbi should be on, one of the Dayanim should be on this panel right now. Rabbi Bresler is doing an amazing job, okay? And if everybody, had Rabbi Bresler as their rabbi, right? That's right. But we know who people listen to. They have to be a very strong partner with what we're trying to do here.
Thank you. Please.
I have a question related to that. I'm Jordan Scorpio. I'm at Shalva. So in terms of bringing the rabbis in, and I was going to ask this before, so thank you for bringing that up. A few of you mentioned that, and I see the deep and important value in that. But what do you do if there's a rabbi who's not on the same page as you when you do bring them in? They don't understand the circumstances of the family or the patient you're working with.
Can I answer that?
You can answer it.
I probably could. We're actually part of the same agency, Estriona Freeman Orthodox Outreach Coordinator. So 2 points. I really want to hear what you do when a rabbi's not on the same page. But I also did want to mention that I think we also need to be aware that there are some, not one rabbi fits every role. So there are some rabbis that are experts, let's say, in the medical field, and they really know and understand. And there are some, like I remember my father needed a liver transplant, and I called my husband's rabbi from yeshiva, from college, and he's like, we were talking about a living liver donor, and he's like, how do you live without a liver? And I'm like, clearly not the right rabbi to ask. And he says to me, clearly I'm not the right rabbi to ask. And I'm like, right. So we moved on, but we didn't know that at the time. So also knowing who to go to for what question is really important. As Shalva, we actually identified 12 rabbis in the community that we trained to work with us, with the clients and with the clinicians to better meet the needs of the Orthodox clients. So if you can tell me what you do with a rabbi that doesn't know what they're saying, let me know.
Thank you.
There's a rabbi of such sort.
Okay, great question. Thank you, Estiona. And well, I've had this experience, and what I have done in the past when this happens is I first discuss with my client why it is we're bringing in this rabbi. Okay, and I try to have a conversation with the rabbi before we bring him in. In other words, I don't want to just drop this rabbi in on a session and then get my, be totally blown out of the water about what's happening. And if I get a feeling that we're not going to be on the same page, my client and I are not on the same page, my client's not on the same page, and this rabbi's on a totally different page, I will, that's then grist for the mill for me to go back to my client and say, okay, I've had a discussion with the rabbi and this is where he's at. Is this really the person that you would like to bring into this session? And then that's part of what we use in our therapy session to discuss whether or not we want to do that. But part of why, of course, you learn by trial by fire, because I have had the experience of bringing in a rabbi without vetting them first and finding out where their brain is at first. What was not good. Wasn't good for me, wasn't good for my clients. So that's what I do as a clinician. It's all part of the therapeutic process, but I have to have a conversation with the rabbi before I let the rabbi walk into the office together with my client.
I wanted to go back to something I said earlier, where this might be a good place for a Jewish chaplain to start the conversation, because Jewish chaplains are trained not to put their own opinion out there, but to help the client figure out their own goals and values. And then once you get a Jewish chaplain involved, that chaplain is likely connected, nearly guaranteed, connected to many rabbis in the community. And so you might start with the chaplain not as the decision maker, but as the person who can get you to where you need to go and can be sort of that unbiased voice to say, what are your goals, right? One question is, well, should I ask the rabbi that question? And I say, well, do you want the rabbi to give you an answer, right? And if the answer is no, then don't ask the question, okay? But sometimes we need to do a little finessing, right, of where to go with that question. And so that might be a good place for Jewish chaplaincy to get involved.
One of the other things I talk with the rabbi about as well is I kind of open up the conversation a little bit more of like, what have they seen and heard that I may have not seen or heard? Because we also make assumptions that our clients are telling us in the room everything, which is not always accurate. They're telling us their perceptions of the situation. And the rabbi may have a different view of them from their encounters or from their partners or from their children or who else they have seen or experienced and the history beyond them. Or they may have an inaccurate picture, but I need to know where they're getting their picture from and what the experiences are that they're naming and and so I need them to do the talking, actually. So I start with questions. I don't make any assumptions about where they got their information from or how they got their information, because do they actually talk to the person or are they just making it out of what they've seen? I don't actually know that they for sure have talked. Sometimes clients say they're close with their rabbi and they're not. Like there's a lot of information that sometimes does or does not get shared with their rabbi. So there's a lot of questions that I ask before even getting into what we need from them in the session, what's happening, exactly, in terms of vetting them. The other piece is when they're making a decision for the client, or if we're talking about a certain topic, I want to know what laws, what halacha they are thinking about. Because what angle are they coming from? Because I may not know, for me, I don't know every halacha. I didn't study, I'm not a rabbi. So like there are things that I hadn't considered. So for example, like I had a situation and I didn't even think about this issue with DCFS. There's an issue where there's a law that we're not allowed to hand Jews over to non-Jews. So certain rabbis will never ever call DCFS because the idea of handing a Jew over to a non-Jew is prohibited in our laws. So that's a problem. So when we talk about what are they basing their decisions off of, then there's a place where I can say like, okay, this is where you're basing your decision on. What about this part of it? Have you thought about this part of it? And then we have a different part of the conversation. But I can't know what they're basing it off of until we have that conversation, right? And then they may not know what I know about DCFS now is that you can elect a victive kin who's a Jew to take your child if you needed it. Oh, so that changes the decision here. And if they know we can put in a liaison present during the interview, great, that's a different thing here now too. So maybe that would change his opinion. So there are ways to also navigate that. And we as potentially as also consultants with you in this conversation, because you may not know what to ask. That's why we have, an advocate at Chicago Hope that can help with what do we ask the rabbi? How do we get through this? All of us can be supportive in that way, would be also a process.
Okay, so now I just want to speak from the rabbi perspective for a minute. I want to make a couple of points. One point is that we've spoken a lot about rabbis today, and I'm speaking for myself, not all rabbis. But rabbis are human beings, right? Rabbis know most things, but not everything, right? That was a joke, in case you're wondering. Of course they know everything. But just like we all spoke about, Dr. Loew spoke about, Dr. Rosen spoke about, we spoke about when working with kids and you bring in parents. And the first job of any good clinician when you're working with kids and parents is to educate, psychoeducate, okay? I was privileged that while I was going through my training in rabbinical school, that I went to YU, the rabbinical school at YU in New York, and my first exposure to mental health was through them, because that was at a time where unfortunately there were some not great stories going on in the news with rabbis, and they took initiative to make a part of their training that all of their rabbis would at least have a greater sense of mental health and what that means. So much so that they started new programs. The way I got into this was while I was doing that training, they started a program in conjunction with their graduate school of psychology. I started while I was in rabbinical school taking just a few classes at night, specially geared towards rabbis that also were able to be put towards a master's in their in their field, in their school of psychology. And I ended up going then for the full master's, and they're doing such a good job of training their rabbis in mental health that some of them are leaving the field for mental health. But my point in bringing that up is that I had some training in addition to my rabbinic training in the field of mental health. Most don't. And rabbis understand, rabbis need, just like anyone else, education. So when we work with a rabbi, when we are bringing them in, right, we're on the same page. Yeah, there will be some rabbis who have firm positions that aren't going to move, and they're going to oppose what we are saying and what we are doing. And that's an issue to be dealt with, right? But many, many, many often or just don't understand what's going on here and need to be educated. So when you're working with a clinician or you're working a child, whoever you're working with, we have to view it as a team, right? Just like with the child is a teammate, the parents are a teammate, the clinician is a teammate. I would prefer to view it, we're not on the same page. Well, if you're a team of surgeons, right, who aren't on the same page, how are you going to work through that? And to emphasize that point also, I think I love this idea that Shalva has specific trained rabbis, and hopefully will continue to train all the rabbis in our community. And that's amazing. And it's amazing to have rabbis who naturally are in tune and understand some of this. And at the same time, we have to think about who is our client, who are we dealing with, and who is their rabbi. I wouldn't say so simply that, oh, this rabbi has a different view on you in this regard. You're not on the same page in this. Let's find a rabbi that does. Yes, you have to know who to ask when. That's true. But you also have to think about the context here, because from a rabbi's perspective, a rabbi develops a relationship in many areas of life over many years. You see him in shul, him or her in shul each and every week, right? And you see them at the shul picnic, and you see them at the community event, and you're there for when their child was born or when their mother died or whatever it was. And that's all part of the relationship. And so like Dr. Rosen said, that, maybe there's parts that we don't know and what's going on here. But also I would strongly encourage, especially if it's someone who doesn't have a relationship with a rabbi and is saying, what rabbi should I choose? Then yeah, let's make sure you choose this rabbi who's especially well trained. But also, right, can we get someone else on the team, or can we educate this rabbi? So I think that team approach needs to be considered also from that perspective.
Thank you very much. I want to make sure everyone knew that the word halacha means both Jewish law, traditional Jewish law in general, and also a specific teaching in some area of traditional Jewish law. And YU is Yeshiva University, in case anyone doesn't know the reference. I'm reminded of one of our previous forums together in this space. It's available, I think we may have on our YouTube channel, which we can share. We had a clinical forum in which we talked about different people involved in trying to address human needs of imagined clients. We came up with scenarios that reflected some complex family situations, and we shared how the rabbi would know a certain part, and then the clinician, educator, and so forth. And we're trying to really do a lot of collaboration to make sure that we're adequately addressing the needs of Orthodox people who come for our services. I'm sure we've got more questions, but we do need to move on, wrap up, and we want to give you a chance for a few minutes of schmoozing if you want to among yourselves. So I'll pass the.
I guess I'm here to wrap up the program and thank our wonderful, wonderful panel. It was fantastic. And I'm hoping that you all have a way of contacting these wonderful panelists, because you may have questions in the future. Don't forget, please, to scan this QR code so that you can take the evaluation. And even if you don't need CE credits, please do so, because we want to continue to bring powerful and meaningful forums to you that address the needs that you want to hear about. So anything else I need to do, Rabbi, to close this out?
CEUs.
What?
The word for
The word for
Code word. Code word.
The code word is May 23.
May 23 is the code word. Anything else missing? No?
And people, please be patient with the CEUs. The CEUs are coming from JCFS. It takes a little time.
They're very busy at JCFS, if you haven't
Sent
figured
you
that out.
by email, so just be patient. It may take a few weeks. Don't worry, they will be coming.
Right. If in 3 weeks you haven't gotten it, then let us know. Yeah, it was wonderful to hear from everybody. I hope you got your questions answered sufficiently. Please reach out to us if you haven't personally. I'm sure each of the people on this panel would be happy to individually take questions or continue the conversation. Thank you so much for coming. There's granola bars and clementines and water in the back. No coffee. Did we get coffee?
Yeah.
Oh, there's coffee. So, we have 10 minutes left, and feel free to continue come up to the panelists if you'd like and have an individual conversation, or schmooze amongst yourself.